On today's World Insight, China's vision and policy on regional security to be delivered before Singapore's Shangri La Dialogue. How crucial is the dialogue amid high geopolitical tensions?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. China's defense minister is in Singapore this week for an official visit and to take part in the 19th Shangri La Dialogue. The event gathers military chiefs of 28 Asia-Pacific states to exchange views on regional security and cooperation. Chinese State Councilor and National Defense Minister Fenghe will deliver a speech on China's vision and on regional policy. So what can we expect from this summit? I have an exclusive interview with Michael O'Halloran from the Brookings Institution. Mr. O'Halloran, much discussion between China and the United States stands about the peace and stability in the region is expected at the Shangri La Dialogue. Now, do you see much chance for divisions?
Well, I'm afraid the divisions are the most visible thing in the U.S.-China relationship. And so that's a good question, but the real question for me is, do I see any cooperation? Will I see any areas of true effort to build new bridges, to try to find areas where we can either defuse tensions or work together? And I'm afraid it's a tough moment right now in U.S.-China relations, as we all know. And I hope that something good will come of the Shangri La Dialogue, but I'm really not sure.
It seems that both are going to present their views and ideas about peace and stability for the region. Well, at the same time, there's also some discussion about whether there could be any chance for bilateral meeting, formal or informal. Now, Mr. O'Halloran, do you see much for the latter?
Well, you know, I never get too worried about whether people meet or not, because sometimes when people meet, nothing good happens anyway. A lot of people were meeting with Vladimir Putin in Russia before February 24th. President Macron would go to see him and others as well, and it didn't make any difference. Also, there are times where not meeting is okay, as long as leaders are genuinely looking for areas of cooperation. And I think that, for example, one thing that China has done well since February 24th is to decide not to provide weapons to Russia, even though we are aware in the United States that China and Russia have a certain form of strategic relationship or partnership. But I think China's done a good thing, but that was China's decision. That was not the result of any US-China dialogue. I mean, there may have been some conversations, but China made its own decision based on its own interests and its own assessment of the situation. So I don't get too worried about whether leaders are meeting or not. I sometimes think it's more important what kinds of conversations are happening with their staffs, what kinds of genuine efforts to cooperate or to defuse tensions are occurring. And sure, if there is a meeting, we'll all be fascinated to read the transcript of what happened or to watch the joint press releases, but I don't think that's really the issue. One more point would be, of course, President Donald Trump frequently met with Kim Jong-un. And I supported that process because I thought that defusing tension and having some dialogue was good, but ultimately it didn't lead anywhere. There was no agenda that was created during those summit meetings. Right. And ultimately the US-North Korea relationship wound up in the same place it began. So you're right to ask the question. It will be an important issue to watch, but I'm more interested in what they might say to each other as opposed to whether they get together.
The contents rather than the formats, right? Let me ask you, Mr. O'Halloran, one of the things China worries is the U.S. is going to focusing throughout the Shangri La Dialogue on the so-called China threat and try to force the neighbors of China to stand in line and form some kinds of alliance or so-called clique against China, both on the issue of Taiwan, which is a sovereign issue China considers, and also the South China Sea, which is also China considers a bilateral and multilateral issues with between China and its Southeast Asian neighbors. Now, Mr. Hannan, given your knowledge about the agenda of the Defense Department and Secretary Austin's personality and mission this time, how do you see this concern coming from China?
Well, first of all, Secretary Austin's very good. And he's also very calm because he has seen a lot of problems in the real world in terms of combat. He was an excellent American general in the Iraq War. He knows the stakes. He understands that it's crucial that the United States and China not fight each other because the combat that could result from that kind of a confrontation is so serious. And someone like him who's been in combat, I think understands that very well. He's also a genuinely decent and good human being. And I think he will go into that conversation with a good attitude. On the other hand, I like the fact that you separate out the two issues you just mentioned, the South China Sea and Taiwan, because I think they actually show the kind of nuance we need in how we try to work together, the United States and China. On Taiwan, as you point out, for China, this is a sovereignty issue. For the United States, this is a solidarity issue with an important democracy that we've been friends with for 40 years. Both sides have very important interests, and we just have to prevent that problem from ever becoming a war. There is just an absolute requirement that we not allow Taiwan, an important but small island of 23 million people, to produce World War III. It would not be, I'm not saying it would be Taiwan's fault, but that issue cannot be allowed to bring the US and China into World War III. And so I think the key is to keep looking for ways to mitigate the issue, to calm the issue, to let time be our ally, instead of trying to force the issue at any given moment.
Earlier, there has been, quote unquote, the strategic ambiguity coming from the United States. And yet, the content of strategic ambiguity and the content that we are talking about today in terms of strategic ambiguity coming from this administration can be, shall I say, argued very differently. This is the bottom line that China has been holding with the U.S. from the very beginning of this bilateral relations. Now, Mr. Hannan, how do you see the discussion going on within the strategic circle in the U.S. about this?
Well, the United States still tends to prefer strategic ambiguity, but I'm not sure that I fully agree, because I think that if China attacked Taiwan, we might or might not respond militarily. We would definitely respond in other ways. And I think China would as well. And the US-China relationship would be changed forever. So we can't really think of this as something where maybe the United States reacts and maybe it doesn't. The United States will react. And the kinds of sanctions that have been imposed against Russia over the Ukraine tragedy would be at least the sort of thing that we would do in response to China. It might hurt us just as much as it hurts China. We know there is a great economic interdependence between the two countries. We might wind up with far worse consequences for our own citizens than we've seen even in the response to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But I do not believe the United States could ever watch China and Taiwan go to war and somehow conduct economic and diplomatic relations as if nothing happened. So China specialists keep debating strategic ambiguity, but there really isn't ambiguity if you think about what a Chinese attack on Taiwan would do to world politics. It would be fundamentally transformative in a bad way.
About the South China Sea issue, China, many experts in the field have pointed out that they noticed the U.S. is trying to let China's neighbors stand in line and trying at this moment to create an ambience in which the U.S. military strength could be moved from the West Pacific to what the U.S. called the Indo-Pacific region and to the South China Sea, and also trying to seek in disguise the opportunity to create military bases in Southeast Asia, which of course is China's neighborhood. As you may know, two big powers, when they are becoming ever more closer militarily, geographically, that's going to be very, very dangerous. So now, Mr. O'Hanlon, how do you see the U.S. should do to reduce the concerns coming from China that the U.S. is trying to create a circling against China militarily through the issue of the so-called South China Sea?
Yes, it's a very good question. There are a few things that I would recommend. One is that in our rhetoric, we should acknowledge that China is not involved in some huge arms race, because China is still spending less than 2% of its gross domestic product on its military. And we spend more than 3% of our GDP on our military. So yes, China's making a lot of investments because China has a lot of economic and scientific power. And that is going to cause concern among American strategists, but we should not necessarily view it as an unfriendly action by China. China has more power. China is going to develop more power. I understand that.
Mr. O'Hanlon, another strategic concern coming from not only China, but also neighbors in the region, at least from China's perspective, is that those countries are being forced to stand in line while they are reluctant. For example, Singaporean Prime Minister have been talking very specifically about the Asia-Pacific region rather than using the phrase of Indo-Pacific. That, to a certain extent, already show quite some attitude, at least about not willing to stand in line. Meanwhile, you also see even countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and some of the others participating in the economic framework that the U.S. tried to establish in the region, and yet reluctant to stand in line in terms of so-called security issues. So how do you see Shangri La Dialogue, which is taking place in the region, would be able to give some balance to all these discussions?
So let's take the Belt and Road Initiative, if we could, to start with that, because a lot of American strategists get very worried about that. And my response is usually to say, listen, if we think that China is doing too much in the region, maybe we should do more and give some of the countries in the region some choices, and they can see where they get the best economic opportunity. Because I think the BRI, I'm not an economist, but when I read accounts of the BRI, in some places it's doing a lot of good. In other places, it may be creating too much debt for countries. And so I think countries need the choice to be able to evaluate a Chinese offer on BRI for their own interests. And so, for example, in some of Southeast Asia, maybe Indonesia, BRI may be good, but BRI might have proposed an expensive concept for Pakistan or Malaysia that led those countries to say, no, we need a different concept. That's a perfectly good debate. And I think the best way for the United States to enter that debate is not to object to BRI, because BRI can do some good things. Instead, we should be helping countries in the region evaluate specific Chinese proposals and determine if those BRI proposals are good for them or not. And if they don't like those BRI proposals, maybe we can offer an alternative. This could be sort of a friendly competition.
Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institutions in the U.S. Next, my conversation with Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, former director of the Center for Security Cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Our focus today is the Shangri La Dialogue, ongoing this week in Singapore. Next, my exclusive interview with Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, former director of the Center for Security Cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of Defense. The issue of Taiwan, it's very much China's bottom line. From China's perspective, how do you see the U.S. recent rhetorics and actions?
Well, I have certainly taken notice that Biden, quote unquote, got for the third time on Taiwan issue during his visit in Japan. This is alarming to China in that all the previous government have maintained that this issue of Taiwan being part of one China issue, although the White House has quickly walked back his comment to say that the U.S. will still stick to its one China policy. But such kind of remarks coming from the U.S. president for the third time is certainly something unusual. So I'm wondering whether the United States is actually changing its one China policy gradually, or if it still talk about one China policy, is it only a kind of lip service, or just by adding something else in it, it is actually making one China policy following up?
Strategic ambiguity has always been the key phrase from the U.S. side. Now, Senior Colonel Zhou, do you see that has been evolving?
Well, that is a good question, because ever since Richard Nixon visited China, American policy towards the Taiwan Strait has been one of the strategic ambiguity. That being said, it will not say for sure whether it would send forces or not should there be a war across the strait. But now we see a kind of strategic clarity, which was initially championed by scholars like Richard Haas. But this debate, even domestically speaking in the United States, didn't win much popularity, because there are some other people like Bonnie Glaser who would argue that should you make it clarified, maybe they would just accelerate mainland's determination to use force against Taiwan. So it's up to them to decide which term they want to use, be it clarity or ambiguity. But whatever it is, it would not affect the U.S. determination in using force as a last resort if, for example, the three conditions laid out in the anti-secession laws were exhausted.
What are these conditions, just for those who are not experts on the day-to-day development of the issue?
So basically, China has expressed that it has utmost sincerity to reach a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but non-peaceful means would have to be employed in three conditions. Number one, Taiwan is declared independence, which I believe is not possible because they know that it will surely invite a military response from mainland. The second thing is, should some major incidents occur which lead to Taiwan being separated from mainland. So we have to wonder what could be these major incidents. For example, the United States is just salami cutting on China's sovereignty. So, for example, Washington Post revealed that the United States actually have been sending troops to train the Taiwanese forces secretly. So all these so-called major incidents. The third condition is that mainland China believes that the possibilities of peaceful reunifications are totally exhausted. So that invites two problems. One is about the ruling party in Taiwan, whether they will still favor this idea of one China. The other thing is, what the role is the United States playing in making the mainland to believe that the chances of peaceful reunion is exhausted.
There were mixed messages coming from Washington. The official line is strategic ambiguity and status quo, quote unquote. And yet, from Biden, the president himself, there have been some quote unquote personal opinions stating otherwise. Now, earlier, Mr. Hannan commented on that issue. I also want to invite your views on that, Senior Colonel Zhou.
Well, I think this is hard to say whether President Biden was talking about as all these factors with a kind of clarity deliberately. So we don't know that, but this is his third time to talk about that. But the other fact is, after he got on Taiwan issue, every time he was walked back by his assistants, by those officials in the White House, who insisted that American one China policy has not changed. that would not deter our determination to reunify with Taiwan through peaceful means. But at the same time, we have to be prepared for the worst scenario, and that's the job of the period.
I do not want to use the exact quote because the White House officials already walked back on the statements or casual words given by the president. And yet, there seems to be indication that the U.S. may use force or military actions if China takes certain actions. Now, that is a very interesting way of saying things. How do you see the different ways that the president of the U.S. is trying to say?
Well, I think whether the U.S. would really send troops to the Taiwan Strait is really a big question, because even according to Taiwan Relation Act, it didn't specify whether the United States would send the troops or not. But I have a very interesting comparison. I look at the situation in Ukraine. From the very beginning, President Biden has made it very clear that the United States would not send the troops into Ukrainian soil to fight directly with the Russian troops. This was reiterated in his opinion, which was published in New York Times almost a week ago. So my question is, if the United States would not send troops to fight against the Russians for fear of the so-called Third World War, why would it become so determined to send troops to Taiwan Strait to fight against the Chinese? Because if you compare China with
Not
Russia,
to mention that the Taiwan issue China consider as a sovereignty issue.
yeah, and I know about 181 countries that includes the United States who have diplomatic ties with China consider it to be a domestic issue of China. China's economy is more than 10 times larger than that of Russia, and China's military expenditure is 3 times larger than Russia. And China has more military ships than the United States, and it is said that China have a sonic system that could carry nuclear weapons, is much more advanced than U.S. officials would believe. And the conclusion of the U.S. that China actually is a more serious long-term threat than Russia. So that means China's strength is much stronger than Russia. So how would the U.S. challenge China militarily while they dare not challenge Russia militarily?
The U.S. is trying to start some kinds of a new Cold War against China. I'm sure many have noticed that the speech given by the Secretary of State Blinken a week ago about the so-called U.S. strategy toward China. And yet many say many of those words are being expressed vaguely without, well, actions are now supporting those words. How do you read the U.S. approach to China now?
Well, I think Secretary of State Blinken's message has something positive in that he said the United States would not want to have a new Cold War with China. But if you just unfold the whole map, you will see that what the U.S. is doing is probably counterproductive. For example, the Indo-Pacific strategy that was published in February. Well, what is the focus? It is very clear. And they made it very clear that it is focused on China. So, and if you look at AUKUS, if you look at the Quad, although these two things are different, but the AUKUS is certainly against China, and the Quad is because of China. And the new economic initiative, the so-called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is not inclusive at all, right? With the China being excluded. How can this kind of economic framework really succeed? Well, it's up to them to see to work it out to let it become successful. But there are so many problems, obviously, there. For example, the best thing all these countries want is access of market. Basically to have more export to American market. But this is not accessible, and it also includes some major economies in the region like China. So I don't believe it will be successful. It is a kind of a good wish, but this is probably wrong number.
Shangri La Dialogue is taking place this week. One of the key for this event is to bring in opinions coming from defense ministers from the Asia-Pacific states. how is this interaction and discussion among them that could help to bring more possibility for peace and stability in the region? Some have been talking about the issue of South China Sea, whether that would become a thorny issue there. Now, Senior Colonel Zhou, your thoughts?
Basically, people go there to watch how China and the United States fight against each other verbally. So that is why American Secretary of State's speech would always be the first one in the first day, and the Chinese Defense Minister's speech would always be the first in the second day. Because in this regard, let me put it another way. If they put the two speeches on in the same day, probably the next day, there would be much less people, watching or reading all this. It would become less interesting. So they always put the two most important speeches on two different days. But this kind of forum definitely would provide a lot of, venues for exchanging views. So apart from all these glittering camera and the conversations, there are, of course, much more quiet bilateral talks, even between China and the United States. So that is where people could actually discuss about things more seriously in many ways. When you talk about South China Sea, that is, of course, is interesting because why? Every time Shangri La Dialogue will certainly include kind of a topic on maritime issue. China, of course, is heavily involved, but so are those ASEAN countries, and with the so-called freedom of navigation of the United States, but also a number of European countries, which appear more and more in this region. Definitely, this is a useful discussion for all people.
So you don't see that is going to create further conflict when the U.S. is still trying to figure out whether their actions are going to match their words in terms of not starting a Cold War against China?
The United States today is not what the United States was after the Cold War, because, well, that is alarming. I read American newspapers and I found that actually 1 in 3 people believe it is justifiable to use force against the government. So quite a few books are already out talking about the possibility of a civil war in the United States. So that brings a problem. You see, for United States to have a stable foreign policies overseas, including on questions of Taiwan, they have to have a stable domestic system, right? So, and actually, Secretary of State Blinken talked about that. And that is always China's view, to make yourself strong first. So that question is, if the United States is not stable domestically, how could they ensure a stable foreign policy? That has a lot of implications for people around the world.
That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.